right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our Lunch and Learn Myths and Marvels of the Human Body. My name is Shannon Cavish. I'm the Health Promotion Specialist with the Office of Health Promotion. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Amberly Reynolds, who is an Assistant Professor of Anatomical Sciences at the SHSU-College of Osteopathic Medicine, with an MS degree in clinical anatomy from Tulane University School of Medicine and a PhD in anatomical education from Indiana University. She's a clinical anatomist by trade and an anatomical education researcher and a teacher at heart. Dr. Reynolds is extremely passionate about sharing knowledge of the human body and the respect we should have for it. And we're very excited to have her present for us today. So take it away, Dr. Reynolds.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So one of my goals as being an anatomist and also being a teacher at heart is just that I spread the message about anatomy and understanding the human body in whatever context that can be. Most of us are exposed to anatomy in some way, especially in pop culture. Almost everybody I know has seen at least an episode of ER, old school, I like to say, my favorite show when I was little itty bitty, and then even Grey's Anatomy now. Well, the interesting thing though is that there's a lot of myths that are propagated because of TV shows like that, but also just in general with the stories and the history of what our parents even tell us as we grow up about our human body. And so what I like to do is kind of find those myths and demystify them for people. And I also like to highlight the marvels of the human body. One of the things we do as anatomists is that we actually dissect human donors who have donated themselves to science. And from that, we often find a lot of interesting anomalies and differences in human bodies. And so because of that background and the misconceptions that come out in pop culture, but also because of what I see in a lab, I really like to make sure people get to question the human body and get answers to some of those questions. And so what we're going to see today are some of those myths and marvels. So I ask you guys to kind of, whether you actually put it in the chat or not, I would challenge you to try and guess before I say it, whether it's a myth or a truth that I'm about to present. So fact or fiction. So these are some of the things we're going to look at. Are carrots good for your eyesight? I'm sure a lot of us heard that, eat your carrots as a kid. What about the number of bones in the adult human body at being at 206 versus infants having 300? Your brain is much smaller than a Neanderthal's brain. Do we have 5 senses? Do you get taller in space? Does size really matter? And your tongue has 5 designated flavor areas, correct? So these are just some of the interesting questions that come up and thoughts I've heard. And so we're going to go through each of these and a few more to determine what is true or false about the human body. So the first one, take a second to think. Do we only use 10% of our brains? Is this a true or a false statement, or a myth or a truth? Okay, I'm getting the mixed bag. I've got a couple myths, I've got a couple truths in the chat. Well, this is actually a very, very large myth that has been propagated everywhere. I'm sure at some point you've had an educator, most likely, or even maybe a parent that said something along the lines of, you know, we only use a small amount of our brain. Imagine what we could do if we used our entire brain. Well, guess what? We actually do use our entire brain. We use way more than 10%. At any one time, the cortex, which is the predominant thought process area of your brain, it's working even when you're asleep. And so you've constantly got areas lighting up and interacting in a sense with other parts of the brain. So really, you're always using more than 10%, even when you're asleep. Also, they do something as this image is a nice artistic representation of it, but it's called functional MRIs. And basically it's to see what parts of the brain are working during different tasks. And MRI scans actually show that even just saying a very solid, like 3 words will light up more than 10% of your brain. So even yes or no is enough to light up 10%. So we are regularly using way more than 10% of our brain. And then also one thing to take note of is that scientists haven't actually uncovered a single area of the brain that doesn't itself impact thought, movement, or your emotions. So pretty much our entire brain at some point in our daily activities and even in our sleep will be working. And at all times, even 3 words lights up at least 10%. So this is a very large myth that is regularly falsified in a lot of different areas of our lives. Next one, 2 things that have to do with eyesight. We hear don't read in the dark or it'll damage your eyes. And we hear that if you eat a lot of carrots, it'll help your eyesight. True or false? Myth or truth? Myth, got one myth. Fact, myth. Somebody privately said maybe one of each. One is myth and one is fact. Well, here's another. They are both considered myths. Neither one of these is true when it comes to our human body. Now, so where do these myths come from? Well, your eyes have muscles around them. So if you look at this actual anatomical drawing of the eye, in order for you to blink your eyelids, there are muscles underneath those eyelids. In order for you to readjust the lens, in order to focus the words on your eye so that your brain can then interpret them, you have muscles that help with that adjustment. So muscles help adjust the lens to help you technically see the words. And you also have muscles around your eyelid to help keep your eye open or closed. So in either case, you have two sets of muscles that are helping you. So when you do read in the dark, do you use those muscles a little more? Yes, because we do the squint, right? You have to squint to really focus because you're fighting the darkness. But just like with any other muscle, as you rest and as you sleep, you will actually be able to recover those muscles. Those muscles don't degenerate just because you're reading in the dark. Instead, you actually relax them and they reset themselves, just as, you know, your thigh or your lower leg would after a workout. So eyes will recover after rest. So reading in the dark, total myth. It's totally okay to read in the dark. Just know that your eyes will get more tired more quickly because you'll be using these two sets of muscles, the eyelid muscles and then also the muscles that help with adjusting the lens. Now, carrots, where did this come in? This is probably one of those old wives' tales that happened decades and decades, hundreds of years ago. There's a lot of history on it, but carrots don't have anything to do with your eyes. It's just a good way for your parents to get you to eat your vegetables. But interestingly, parents should change their story because carrots are helpful in the sense that they have a large amount of vitamin A, and vitamin A is an antioxidant, which can help your muscles recover. So it actually can help with muscle degeneration. So maybe that's where the overlap happened with eating your carrots in your eyes. They do help your muscles recover and regenerate, but they don't actually have anything to do with your eyesight. All they do is help the muscles. So the next one, astronauts are taller in space. Myth or fact? Fact. And I kind of give it away. Does anybody know who these two astronauts are that we're seeing in this picture? If you can squint hard enough, I think it's on their the lapels. The Kelly twins, exactly. This is Scott that you're seeing on your right-hand side, and this is Mark on the left. They are both now retired astronauts, but they are also relatively identical twins. At one point in their life, they were much more identical, but interestingly, space has caused a lot of changes in one. So Scott here on the right is the longest, he's the American who has served the longest amount of time in space. And his brother Mark, although he did spend time in space, did not spend as much. And so what NASA has done is they actually have a designated area called Human Subjects Research, where they actually used the Kelly twins to do research on what happens to the human body in space. And interestingly, thanks to Scott spending almost an entire year in space, we found out that the human body goes through a lot of changes when it's in an anti-gravity situation. So this, as many of you were saying in the chat, knowing not only the Kelly twins, but also knowing that this is a truth. Astronauts do in fact get taller in space. Now, that may be a positive thing, but anti-gravity can actually be very negative for the human body. In space, your arteries get harder, you get more inflammation. So your immune system is slightly unhappy. It gets really inflamed. You also have, like I said, arteries hardening, which is not good for blood flow when you return back to Earth. So that's kind of the negative side. But interestingly, we get taller. You potentially would get taller. And then also your telomeres get longer. And your telomeres, if you know what they are, they're actually kind of considered the area of your genes that has to do with longevity in life. So if they get longer, is there a chance that you would live longer? It's one of the things they're actually looking at with the Kelly twins. Kind of sad to think of that they would be looking at that, but it would help to understand what anti-gravity does. Now, how exactly did Scott over here grow about 3% taller than his twin brother in microgravity? Well, when you look at the human spine, you'll see that there are vertebrae, which are the bones, and then in between each vertebrae, there's an intervertebral disc. And that intervertebral disc is very compressed because of gravity, especially also because we're bipedal and we stand on two legs. But as you stand up, the vertebrae actually compress this disc and flatten it out, hence putting you a little more squat in nature. Now, when you're up in space, as Scott was for almost a year, without the compression of these vertebrae and gravity pulling everything down, the intervertebral disc is able to expand. And because that intervertebral disc is able to expand, you actually grow in size. Now, when he got back to Earth, did they all start to compress? Yes, they did. But because there had been such a long time for expansion in that spine, he actually to this day is still slightly small or taller than his brother Mark. If you're interested in what space does to the human body, I suggest this link. This is a great link to go to. And like I said, NASA has an entire site dedicated to understanding the Kelly twins and what's different between them. They're also working currently on taking ultrasound devices up into space to actually study the spine up in space and see if they can come up with some good rehab techniques for people here on Earth. So that could be a whole lecture in itself of understanding what space does to the human body. So our next fact or fiction, do we have five senses, excuse me. Everybody's saying myth. Good, this is very good. I see a trend, right? Everybody's like, is there gonna be any more truths? So with five senses, that is a very large myth. We do have five basic senses, right? We have sight, sound, or hearing, smell, taste, and touch. Those are what we call the basic senses, but we actually have at least 21 senses in the human body. Depending on what level of physiology you look at, there are also scientists out there that are arguing there's up to 58. Even this anatomist questions 58, but I can understand 21. We have at least 21, some of which would include proprioception, which is your ability to understand where your body is in space. So me holding my hands up, it's the ability of my brain to sense that my hands are in front of my body, not behind my body, that they're higher than my heart versus lower. That's proprioception. You also have balance, or it's sometimes called equilibrioception, temperature, thermoreception. And then one of my favorite ones, it's not listed here, but it's called nociception. Anybody know what nociception is? Probably one of I would beg to say it's one of your most important senses, nociception, N-O-C-I-ception. Anybody want to take a guess? What would nociception mean? Not seeing it come in, but nociception is pain, perception of pain. So we have a very specific system in the human body that manages our pain responses and our pain reception. So 5 basic senses, but at least 21, with one of the most important being, in my opinion, nociception, which is pain perception. So are teeth meant to be white? True or false? Good. I'm seeing a lot of people saying that's definitely a falsity. So contrary to the fact that pop culture, celebrities, and many, many TV commercials and internet ads will tell you that you should be working towards picture number 3 here, which is white teeth, the reality is that your teeth are not meant to be white. This minute 1 over here, which they're using as the, oh no, your teeth are this color, that's actually your normal color. Yellowish teeth are very normal. It's actually more normal to have yellow teeth than it is to have white. Now, why is that? Well, in looking at the anatomy, you have the structure of a tooth, as I've shown here in this picture. And when you look at the actual tooth structure, what we're looking at on the top is the enamel. That's the hard, quote unquote, white area. And that's what they color it in every picture, white. But in reality, enamel is actually whitish in the sense that it's very thin and it's relatively translucent. So depending on how light is hitting it, it should look yellow. And that's because in being translucent, it allows the dentin, which is the main component of your tooth. It allows that dentin shadow or that coloring to show through. And so having yellow teeth is normal. That just means that you have a solid amount of enamel or a solid amount of dentin underneath your enamel, which means it's very, very healthy. Now, your enamel up here, which gives off a whitish appearance because of its translucent ability and also allows for that yellow to shine through. What do you think we're doing when we put all these different chemicals to get white teeth? What do you think you're actually doing to this enamel layer? There's two things that are actually happening. One's okay, one's not so okay, right? One is very good. Got two people that answered, and one gave the good and one gave the uh-oh. So the first one is some of the products are actually just staining it. It's almost like putting a layer of paint on your tooth. I would say if you ever look at some of those whitening strips, some of them even come with what looks like a paintbrush and you're like applying it on. That's in a sense almost staining your teeth. So some of them actually have qualities where they're adding not a layer of enamel, but essentially kind of a layer of shellac in order to stop that reflection or that reflective property and translucent property to stop the yellow from shining through. The other side of things, which is the danger side, which is why you should always check with your dentist what you're doing, is that on the other side, what you're doing is you're putting products on your teeth that are actually stripping away some of this enamel in order to try and make it rough, and that roughness will stop the translucency. But over time, getting rid of that smooth translucent layer and turning it into a rough kind of, I call it a rough road is what you turn it into. If you do that over time, which may make it look white because it stops the translucency, over time though, you're actually getting rid of the enamel to the point where you're gonna start having cavities, potentially need to go in for root canal, because if things can get into this root cavity, you're causing infections. So very important that you check out what you're putting on your teeth. Yes, pop culture tells us to have white teeth, but it's actually very normal to have that yellow. It's actually probably more healthy too, because that means you're not messing with the enamel too much. So at this point, I'm going to take just a 1 minute little break. And if anybody has any quick questions about the ones we went through, you can put them in the chat. If there's anything that's interesting that's popped up or anything that you want to ask a further detail on, you can throw it in the chat. And if I don't get anything, then I'll move on. But again, I'm going to give about a minute here to wait. And every instructor always has a problem with this waiting process. So I find the Kelly twins story very interesting. Mark also looked larger as well as taller. Was that due to him being in space? Very good, very, very good perception. So yes, with the Kelly twins, one of the most interesting things they found, it's not actually that the body is changing or the muscles is changing necessarily in space, although in space, because of anti-gravity, you're not resisting. So obviously muscles aren't working as hard in space. Therefore, if you saw Mark, as Megan has pointed out in the chat, Mark looks a little bulkier and larger in structure. And that's because he's on Earth resisting gravity. And so lifting up a box is heavy, right? And so he probably does have some more actual muscle building, whereas in space, Scott is not having to resist gravity. And so his muscles, they didn't degenerate, and they wanted to point this out very clearly, NASA has. It's not that the muscles are deteriorating, it's just they're a little more lean instead of bulky because he's not having to resist gravity. But the most interesting thing, and I just find this fascinating, is that astronauts, because of the limited amount of food that they have, they actually eat much healthier in space than you can on Earth. And because of how healthy Scott was while he was there, because of what limited food he has, he actually really, really lean. His body got very lean and super what they would call healthy in comparison to Mark. Not that Mark is unhealthy, but we know propagated by culture, the terms health and unhealthy are used. But Scott actually got very lean, and all of his nutrient numbers and vitamin levels were much better than Mark's were because of how good his nutrition was in space. Which is sad to say, because it's like if you'd have to restrict yourself to like freeze-dried food in order to have that kind of health. But it's something that NASA is looking at, is how can they promote kind of that very healthy diet that Scott had up there. So interesting facts, but I like that pointed out. But yeah, if you go to that human research office that they have at NASA, you can find so much about the Kelly twins. I mean, they should honestly write a book about them, because it's intriguing, their story, but also the anatomy that's happened. Great, so now we're gonna move to the next myth or truth. Do your fingernails and hair keep growing post-mortem or after death? True or false? Do we see growth in hair and fingernails after death? True for a little bit. Okay, so I'm seeing some people right. Some got a false. I've heard this before, but I'm going to say false. So this, the show Bones, I have an anthropologist colleague, and she would be remiss if I didn't tell you that this is a complete lie. And if you talk to any of your any people over here that work at the staffs, the anthropology center, they would very much want you to know that this is a total myth. And yes, it's been said, and I have seen, as somebody pointed out in the chat, that it happens for a short time, right? Completely false. What actually happens is that after death, post-mortem, you actually go through dehydration. And so this is an optical illusion that happens to the human body. After death, because of dehydration, your skin is actually shrinking. And because of the shrinking, it pulls away from the cuticles, it pulls away from the hair follicles, and therefore it actually makes it look like the hair has grown a little bit and your fingernails have grown a little bit. But in reality, pure optical illusion. It's just dehydration making things appear. It's because the skin is shrinking back from the follicle or the nail bed. So salty, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami, these are the 5 flavors that we can taste. Is this image that you see on the left of the screen true or false? Are these the areas of the tongue in which you taste these different flavors? Nobody's believing it. What is umami? So I have a hard time describing umami as well, and that's because I'm a vegetarian, and apparently umami is very much associated with kind of a savory flavor that comes with fish and meat. A lot of people will tell you that, and also soy a lot of times will come with that. So umami, the flavor, fish and meats and soy, like soy sauce. Those are kind of the 3 big things that they use to describe umami. But yes, and somebody pointed out, good. So I thought umami was sushi. Yeah, that unagi, slightly close. So where does this come from? Because let's be real, this image, I have a feeling that if you took a science class in high school, or even if you in elementary school had a science class, at some point you talked about how, oh, you taste salt, and then you have like sweet areas of your tongue. So why have we propagated this myth in pop culture? Well, a couple of things with this. There's a few myths that go with this. First off, umami wasn't even considered a flavor until the last couple decades. So that wasn't even part of the history of this. Initially, it was only 4 flavors. So we proved ourselves wrong, and we have 5 now. Additionally, you don't just taste on your tongue. So if you look in the back of this image and you're looking back where we all like to see the little thingy that hangs in the back of your throat, it's called the uvula. If you look back there, the 2 arches that you're seeing back there are formed from a component of your body called the soft palate. And that soft palate is what it raises up and down as you swallow. It's very important to swallowing to help close off your nasal passage so that food goes down instead of back up. So what's important about that soft palate is that it also has taste receptors on it. So you don't only taste on your tongue, you taste on the soft palate and back, and then also the very top of what's considered your throat, or what we call the pharynx in anatomy. It also has taste receptors. So you actually have multiple areas of the mouth and the oral cavity that taste. So first off, we have 5, not 4 flavors now. Then when research figured out that we actually have taste receptors in multiple areas, not just the tongue. So that defeats this tongue map. And then additionally, although there is truth to say that the tip and the edges of your tongue have the highest density of taste receptors, all of these tastes or these flavors can actually be found everywhere in your tongue. These areas that are highlighted in what we call the tongue map just happen to be the area in which, if you put that flavor component in that area, it just reacts the fastest. It's not the only thing, it just reacts the fastest. So the history behind this, I think, is very interesting. But back in 1901, a German scientist named David Honig, he actually was measuring the threshold for taste perception. So like I said, he was kind of putting drops of different flavors. And at this point, umami wasn't a thing. So just the sour, sweet, bitter, and salty. He was putting it on different places in the tongue, and he was just noting which area had the quickest reception. So yes, if you put salt on the tip of your tongue and sugar, you'll taste the salt first. That doesn't mean you can't taste sweet, it just means the salt will come through first. So it just means it's physiologically that you're hitting a threshold faster. So that's what he was doing. Well, in doing this, he actually produced this graph. Yes, it's in German. You can probably figure a few out. Bitter translates the same. Sour looks like sour. And then Sulz is salt. So I think it's relatively understandable. But when you look at this, this is what he produced. And he was basically doing it as a physiological experiment to say which part of your tongue has the fastest reaction. Well, then a very interestingly named Harvard psychologist named Edwin Boring actually took this graph and interpreted it himself to create what we know as the tongue map, which is what you're seeing in that image, which is that certain areas of the tongue taste certain things. And guess what? People ran with that image that he created. They assumed that he had interpreted the science right, and it's been literally history ever since, although it's been incorrect the entire time. So somebody asked in the chat, maybe you'll cover this, but I hear that sense of smell affects taste. It does. So we have taste receptors, and then the full complexity of flavor and what you can what we refer to as like, this is really good or delicious, that comes from a combination of not only these taste receptors, but also the combination of your brain interpreting the smell. And so in smelling, you have olfactory components or particles that go to your brain for interpretation. On your tongue, you're going to get one of these 5 taste receptor situations, or I should say a balance of them. So it's salty, it's a little bitter, it's really sour. The 2 of those put together is what your brain will interpret as a full flavor profile, and that will tell you whether you love it or you hate it. So if you plug your nose, you can still taste sour, sweet, bitter, salty, but you wouldn't be able to actually say, ooh, that's like a piece of fish, or that's a candy. You would just be able to say it's salty, sweet, bitter, sour. So beyond these 4 or 5 now with umami, beyond those 5, if you want more complex and more descriptive flavor, you have to have smell, which is why if you lose your sense of smell, we've all been there with a cold or a flu and we've been plugged up, you'll know that you can kind of tell that something's salty, you can usually tell if something's sweet, but you can't actually get a full flavor profile. Great question. So next potential one, hopefully this one's easy. Don't break this anatomist's heart, but is it true that we have blue blood, or are our veins actually blue? When you look on your arm and you see the blue, are they actually blue in there? Myth or truth? Somebody's just messing with me. I had a cousin lose a sense of smell in an accident and completely change his eating habits. Yep, if you lose smell, you really lose the fun of flavor, because all you get is those very basics. Yep, fingers crossed, no way. So this one, hopefully, like I said, I mean, you could totally believe this. It's true, because again, you look at images online, they propagate the myth. There is no such thing as blue blood. So as you see here, somebody's donating blood. It's clearly coming out of the body red. You see images like this. Yes, that's red blood cells. This is a beautiful image. This is an accurate image in the human body. It's blue because of the light through which the photo is being taken. But we also use blue and red in anatomy. If anybody's taken anatomy or been in any biology class, you almost always color blood coming from the heart, oxygenated blood, red, and then you color blue, the blood blue if it's going back to the heart after having dropped off the oxygen. Therefore, it's deoxygenated. Now, add that coloring to the fact that when you look at your arms, your legs, your body, and you see blue veins, it's no wonder that if you go to an elementary school and if I ask this question to a bunch of young kids, they would tell me, yeah, you have blue blood, see? And they will point. Well, why is that? Why are we actually seeing blue on the outside of our body? And again, we ourselves as anatomists propagate it by using blue and red as our 2 colors on graphics, but it's actually a falsity. Why do I see blue on my arm? Well, it's a physics concept more than anything. Blue blood, as I said, usually represents deoxygenated. One thing to point out is that when you do see the blue on your arm, it is a vein. So the truth in this statement that we're talking through is that your veins do look blue from the outside. Your arteries, first off, are usually deeper, so we can't actually see them, which is protective for you because we don't want arteries with all the pressure in them to be anywhere near the surface of your body. But the veins, being light in pressure and carrying deoxygenated blood, can be a little more superficial. Not to say that's not dangerous in some way, but it's a little better than arteries being on the surface. More importantly, the reason it's blue is actually because the tissue that covers your veins messes with how your body absorbs and scatters light. So like I said, it's more of a physics concept. It's the physics of how the light is interacting with your skin and what melanin or color you have in your skin. And that reflection and scattering of light is actually what causes it to look blue. But again, you put a needle into that, what looks like a blue vein, it's actually going to have bright red, very, very dark red blood coming out of it. So physics sometimes likes to mess with what we talk about in anatomy. But again, we also make it hard on ourselves by using red and blue as our colors in anatomy. So that one was a pretty straightforward one. So this one, our brain is smaller than a Neanderthal's brain. And again, look at the image. True or false? Our human brain is smaller than the Neanderthal brain. It's a fact. Fact. I got somebody that says false. So do anybody want to give me a reason why you think it is true that our brain is smaller than the Neanderthal brain? Why would we say that it's smaller? I love that we're getting a mix. We got false and then we've got the true, every single one. There's only been a few that everybody's agreed on. Our skull is smaller. So yeah, so just in the graphic alone, you're seeing that. You're seeing that this representing the modern human has a much smaller skull or cranium, whereas you see over here in the Neanderthal, it's a much larger skull cap, as we would say, and a vault. And so hence, if it's a bigger vault, it's probably going to carry more, which would mean that the brain is bigger. So it is true that our brain is actually smaller than the Neanderthal. Now, cause and effect here. Do you think that because our brain is smaller, that means we're not as smart as the Neanderthal? What do we think? Do we think we are as smart as the Neanderthal? Do you think the Neanderthal was smarter than us? Okay, one of the med students out there is making all the great connections. We likely have more neural connections, so potentially they're the same. So there's a lot of hypotheses behind this, and this is a little more, again, anthropology based. But what's interesting is that although we can see in this image that this accurate Neanderthal skull is much larger, has a much larger vault, and likely carried a much larger brain compared to our human skull of modern man. The actual reason for that, they've looked at using computational neuroanatomy, and I think this Oxford scientist said it best. She said, our ancestors had larger bodies than us, and they needed larger brains to control and maintain those bodies. So essentially, Neanderthals needed a bigger brain or more neural tissue because they had to control a much larger body. That's the basics of it. And then I'm going to put it out there to let the student in the chat that also said maybe it's because of the neural connections. Well, that goes with this. They had larger brains. Those larger brains were able to control their larger bodies. But also in our bodies being smaller, more compact, and more physically apt at doing fine motion, our neural connections have been really fine-tuned and they've become very precise. And because of that, we've narrowed down the brain a little bit and making it really fine-tuned. So I always like to compare this to, if you ever look back at computers when they were first coming out, like when you look at the 80s and you look at what a computer looked like, it's literally like an entire room of equipment to manage like a screen that didn't even have internet, right? It was just to do a Word document, but it was an entire room. And then as the people in information technology have worked over time, they've been able to lessen the size. And now we literally carry a phone in our hand, or a computer in our hands, right? That's what happened with brains. So Neanderthal, lots of space, lots of stuff to go into producing what the human body could do. And now it's been fine-tuned and regulated to a much smaller brain to control a bit of a smaller body. So here we get into one of the things that pop culture puts out there a lot. This is a scene directly from Grey's Anatomy, and you'll see this a lot. Is it true or false that if you have a flatlining heart, that stereotypical on the TV screen, that beep sound, then you should get the defibrillator out? Yes or no? Should you get the defibrillator out with a flatlining heart? True or false? True, okay. True, okay. So it looks like everybody's in agreement on this. Well, guess what? Completely a myth. A defibrillator will do nothing for a flatlining heart. So the way I like to look at this is an analogy in saying that you can't charge a dead heart, just like you can't necessarily jump a completely dead battery. There has to be some shockable rhythm. And so if you actually look at imaging, so this is an EKG of a normal rhythm. These are the different waves you should see. And so if you look down here at this patient's EKG, you'll see this here is not a normal. You're not getting all the waves we should get if you compare it to this upper picture. This is considered a shockable rhythm. There is still some movement. There's still some electrical activity, which means I could get a defibrillator out and use it on a patient that is in a very difficult electrical state. When you get to this point where there is an actual flat line and there is zero electrical activity, you cannot actually get the defibrillator to regenerate electricity. So it's propagated and it's very much put out there in pop culture, Grey's Anatomy, ER, Scrubs. I think if you think of any, also like Bones, we'll talk about like flatlining, any medical show, lots of TikToks, lots of YouTube videos, they'll put it out there that you can actually bring a heart back from this. So what does it mean to use the defibrillator? Well, like I said, in order for a defibrillator to actually do its job, which is to bring somebody back, is how we look at it, there has to be at least some little bit of wave. So even this area here where you're just seeing a small amount of electrical activity, this is still a shockable rhythm. But if it is completely flatlined, it is highly unlikely that a defibrillator is going to do much. Let me see. Somebody said I need to go back to school. It's all good. These are just fun things. It only regulates the heartbeat, right? So it's only the electrical activity is regulating the propagation of the signals down the heart in order to cause an actual contraction. So I always say the EKG is measuring only electrical. And so that's what you're looking at with defibrillation, is only electrical. So then that kind of is I think this is where the next question is getting at. So how do surgeons restart hearts after heart transplants? Well, what's interesting is that most of the time, there's still the electrical capabilities of the heart. All the wiring is still there in the transplant, in the heart. You oftentimes will hook them up to machine, but then there's also that you can physically massage a heart to try. So there's physical ability of the heart to pump. That's one thing, but you also have to have a full electrical set of wires. So the wires have to work, the physical contraction has to work, and then both of them together make a working heart. So in terms of a defibrillator, you can have a perfectly solid muscular heart, but if it doesn't have the proper wiring, you can't jump it back. Transplant wise, you take a heart out of somebody, a good heart, right? If for organ donation, you take this heart out, that heart is going to have appropriate wiring. It's not dead in the sense of the wiring's gone. It's just for the time being, the wiring's not being used. You put that heart into somebody, reconnect all the wires, you can actually defibrillate that type of heart. But you would never say that was a flatlining heart because the electrical activity can still be there. I hope that answers that question. So a couple more here. Do we as adults have 206 bones and infants have 300? In fact, in the chat, that is correct. So if you actually look, I think most people know this. This is a relatively common one that is truth. Babies actually have more flexible cartilage. In order for them to get through the birth canal, they need to have some cartilaginous area. So in this image of this infant, they're showing, excuse me, they're showing cartilage in green. And what you'll notice is that almost every single joint has a bunch of cartilage around it. And that's because the baby's body needs to be relatively flexible in order for it to pass through the birth canal, but also in order for it to grow and to lengthen and to get all those joints in proper alignment. So actually babies have more bones because they have a lot of pieces that haven't yet come together and formed a full solid bone. As you age, especially going towards puberty, you get a lot of growth around the growth plates, and then they start to solidify into bone. And so the cartilage gets replaced with bone. Yep, fact, yep, exactly. So this is very common. And I think most people know this, especially because if you ever talk about babies, you hear about soft spots on their heads. Those soft spots are called fontanelles, and it's basically a little fibrous membrane there, which you have to be very protective of because there is no bone. And if you push really hard on that, you can actually fill a brain in a child, and doctors do in order to fill things. But through that fontanelle, you need that in order for the cranial bones to move in order to get through the birth canal. So that one very much is true. So this one, I put a few facts up here. Is there a function to the appendix. True or false? Is the appendix functional? No, 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 it's not. I got one person said yes. It's not a necessary function. Ooh, good way to look at it. It's got a function, but it may not be necessary. I like it. So what you're seeing on the screen are the different things I've heard, and there's many. First off, I've heard it's useless. Other times I've heard that it's a vestigial organ or an organ that we used to use that we no longer use. Some people say it's just still there as a warning signal if something's going wrong with our bodies. Some people say it serves as a reservoir. So what's the truth behind this? So do we have a functional appendix? We actually do. All of these are in a sense myths in the true sense because our appendix is actually very functional. So to kind of get to the truth of what the appendix does, your appendix actually serves as a reservoir for helpful bacteria. So it has microbes that actually help us fight disease. Without that appendix, it's okay because you'll still have some of that appropriate biome in your intestines. But typically, if it's not inflamed, it actually can serve as a place for extra microbes to exist to fight disease. Additionally, they have found that your appendix in your early years when you're very young can actually help form white blood cells and some of your antibodies. So it assists with your immune system in two different ways, with microbes and with producing white blood cells. And then what's most interesting, I think, is that some scientists in recent years, excuse me, some scientists in recent years have actually taken the appendix and been able to adapt it as a replacement for urinary ducts. Think about that. And look at this image for a moment because I think it's hilarious. So functional appendix, yes, it has some very important functions, helps us with microbes, helps us with our white blood cells. And if you still have it, it may help you with some replacement surgeries of the urinary ducts. If anybody's interested in an article about this, it is intriguing and I can send it to you if you request it. So getting to the fun facts, I used to be a high school science teacher, so let's just say I got a lot of questions about things like this, these last couple that we have on here. So male shoe size correlates to penile length, true or false? Very much shown in pop culture. False, false, false so far. Any truths out there? So contrary to the fact that every one of my high school students would tell me this is the truth, even to this day, because that's just high schoolers, this is actually, as you all pointed out, a myth. This is completely propagated by pop culture. A lot of musicians, a lot of celebrities put that out there, athletes put this out there a lot. But in reality, there are many studies that show that this is a complete falsity in the sense that there is no correlation. In one study by London urologists in London, they actually measured the penile length in about 104 men and compared that to shoe size. Like no correlation at all. If you look at the graph, it's non-existent. Interestingly, they found that the average stretched penile length was about 5 inches, while the average UK shoe size was a 9, which equals out to 10 inches. So essentially shoes, if you want to make a statement, this study would have actually shown that typically shoe size is about twice as big as, or shoe or foot length is twice as long as it. I am interested though, and this is something that I want to point out about this, and there's a lot of studies, it did intrigue me that they actually stretched the penis out in order to test this. I do think that's interesting that that's how they conducted their science, but you'll see that in a lot of studies as well. So you could this could go into a whole conversation about reproductive health and also about how science is done differently in males versus females. Foot size has to do with stability for height, right? Taller people need bigger feet. Yes. So a lot of it actually has to do not only with height, but the pelvic, how your pelvis sits. Because in being bipedal organisms and the way that we hold our pelvis and we stand, you have to have a center of balance. And in having that center of balance, depending on how wide your hips are and then also how tall you are, your center of balance changes. And because of that center of balance changing, we obviously have to change how big the feet are. So larger feet typically are on taller folks because their center of balance is higher up, so they need more stability at the bottom. Okay, and then this leads us into, I believe this is our last one. So in this sense, these are kind of two things that are put out there. First off, that size matters, and oftentimes this is said in a male-directed way, although that's not actually accurate because of different relationships between people. But they'll say size matters, and also that the vaginal canal can be completely stretched out. And this goes down to the fact that sometimes we have surgeons that promote like vaginal rejuvenation. So true or false, I hope most people know that these are definitely falsities that are promoted, highly promoted in TV shows and anything that highlights plastic surgery. So what do we mean by size matter? So a lot of males in particular will talk about the penile size mattering in a sense. Well, the reason I say that this is a myth is because if you actually look at this image and you look at the science behind it, the vaginal canal is only in truth between 2.75 to 3.25 inches. It's a relatively short canal before you get to this area called the cervix. And so length wise, it's really not that large of a canal. It's also an entirely muscular organ, which means that it's not only not very tall, it's also not very wide. And so size, does it really matter? No, because honestly, in all seriousness, you can't go much farther than about 3 to 4 inches in. And the reason I say 4 inches in is because when a woman is in an aroused state, the vaginal canal can expand. Now, what does that mean? Does it grow? No, it just means that the cervix actually lifts itself up just slightly during arousal, which means you get a little bit more. But in reality, the vaginal canal is not long enough for some of these things that pop culture propagates. And so I like to defeat this myth and saying, no, it really doesn't matter. And then also, is the vaginal canal stretched out? Why do we have plastic surgeons that are constantly promote, not all, but some on shows promote vaginal rejuvenation? Well, the reality is that the vagina is a muscle. So just like we've talked about with the eye muscles, it can rest and relax and relatively go back to size. Now, there's a little bit of truth. It's not that it's stretched out, but because of tears that can happen, it could potentially, you could tear some muscle fibers. That's not the same as being stretched out. If as a muscle cavity, it can actually go back to the norm. But over time, if you rip and tear a lot of that muscle tissue, yes, there can be a little bit of a laxity to it. But no, you can't completely like overstretch it and it will never go back. It will always relatively return to a specific range of width. So during, like I said, during penetration, the vaginal canal can get a little bit longer. But I also want to point out that this image does a really good job. This is showing how to use a menstrual cup. And this alone, they did a great in their advertising. They're basically showing you that the vaginal canal is different for different people, but really it's not that much different in length. You've got a couple inches based on fingers, 2 to 3 inches, like it said in the writing. And then you've got sometimes somebody that has a lower cervix, and so it's a much shorter canal. So really the vaginal canal, much shorter than people like to think. And then again, the vaginal canal is relatively elastic, given the fact that if you've had multiple births or some different injuries that could cause some tearing, that may impact, I don't call it stretching, I call it tearing, because stretching is a different term. So with that, I want to leave you with some more information to learn more. If you are interested in any of these topics that I've listed here on the side, and if you think of anything, so I sometimes will talk about the history of body donation and how that came about, how we use donors, reproductive system myth could be its own thing, medical misconceptions in pop culture. We talked about a few, but man, bones, scrubs, like I said, ER, Grey's Anatomy, we could do lectures and lectures on all of the misconceptions of those. Or if you have another one, you can always put it in the chat, and that gives me some note of what people are interested in hearing, and then maybe one day we can put one out there. But also, these are all books I own, and I highly suggest you look at if you're interested in kind of the weird and interesting world of anatomy. These are great books to look at. And if you liked the appendix comic, it came from this book called How I Broke Up with My Colon. Yes, House is another one, although House is probably the most accurate TV show. We'll put that out there. It's got more accurate than the rest. So that is where I leave you. So I will open it up for a few questions if anybody has it. I'll take my screen share off so I can see people's faces. But
while you are asking questions, I'm also going to launch a poll here within Zoom that we would really appreciate it if you would complete that before you log off of the Zoom just to help us improve our programming. So it should just pop up on your screen. But yes, if anyone does have questions, please feel free to ask Dr. Reynolds before she leaves.
And I do appreciate that, Megan. We need a consultant on these shows. You know what's interesting? There's a consultant on every one of those shows. It's a paid anatomist, anthropologist, or physician. But what I like to call Hollywood, they will pay that person, but they don't always listen to that person because entertainment and money matters more. So unfortunately, a lot of times those people get their truths get overridden by these myths because the myths are way more fun, right? So.
Dr. Reynolds, I just want to say this has been so interesting to me, and I feel so silly about the blue blood question. And I put that one as true because I could have swore, and it might have been from a TV show or, just hearing around, but I could have swore that I always heard growing up that your blood is so dark that it appears blue, and then once you cut it, and that's when it turns that bright red. So this has just been so mind-blowing to me, some of these myths and facts that you gave us today. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. And you are correct in that is another way that they promote the story about blue blood, is that they say, especially because of our images, they say, well, blue means it's deoxygenated. So then when we cut ourselves, it gets oxygen from the air, so it turns red. But again, it's not actually blue in that vessel. It's just the way the walls of the vessels are being reflected with our skin and the light coming in. But I agree, that is definitely one I've heard before propagated, and I guarantee it's been on a show at least once or twice. Yeah.
Science, man, we're always learning something new.
Any other questions? Otherwise, I hope everybody has an amazing afternoon, and I thank you for joining me. I enjoy doing stuff like this. So again, if there's any, my information was on that first slide, and I know they said they would put this on YouTube, so feel free. I'm always an email away, and I would love to chat more or, talk about myths and truths with anybody that wants to, or to give you more recommendations on books, because I'm all about those.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reynolds. This was great.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.